We're going to look at the muscular system and the adipose system and how they develop. Remember that these are individual structural constraints, and so as they develop and change, we would expect the interaction with the other constraints on the triangle to mean that we get observable differences in the motor pattern. Okay? So, let's have a look. So, prenatally, the muscular system grows by hyperplasia, which is increasing the number of cells, and hypertrophy, the cells that are laid down get bigger. Postnatally, growth in the muscular system is mostly by hypertrophy. All right, so the cells that are already there continue to grow in size and function. Okay, so we don't typically lay down new muscle cells once we're born. Okay, so when we look at training programs and we're looking at trying to increase the strength and the size of muscles, we're not laying down new cells. All right, what we're doing is making the cells we have bigger. At least that's what we think at the moment. Right? So as with the other systems, we see a typical S curve for the development of the muscular system, so rapid growth during the first and into the second year, and then steady growth until the individual hits puberty, and then remember that the skeletal system grows first, and then the muscular system follows on once the skeleton has got bigger, right? So the muscles, skeletal muscle is made up of little units called sarcomeres. You can imagine them like end-on-end dominoes, right? So to get thicker and longer, the body has to add more dominoes to the muscle. Okay? So once we are going through puberty, before puberty, we really don't see a significant difference in musculature between boys and girls. All right? So, boys and girls are about the same strength as each other before puberty. They've got about the same amount of muscle before puberty, and then with the release of those sex hormones, everything changes. All right? So we get a very dramatic difference during puberty and after puberty and adolescence in strength between boys and girls. So if you're going to work with PE with children before puberty, being worried about strength and the boys hurting isn't an issue. Post-puberty, you've got to be a little bit more careful on how you set things up and the boundaries that you set on tackling or pushing or those kinds of things. Okay? Okay, so when you take exercise physiology, we do a lot more about muscle fiber type. But we'll just go through a little bit because there's some interesting impacts on children, okay? So when we look at muscle, skeletal muscle, then we have two groups of muscle type. Type 1, which used to be called slow twitch. So they're the muscles that we use for moving around for a long period of time, going for a long bike ride. Right? We're going to use mostly type 1s. And then we have type 2s, which used to be called fast twitch, and they can contract much more quickly and create more power. So they're the muscle fibers that we use to sprint or to jump. Okay? And type 2s are divided into two at the moment in humans. Right? We have type 2A and type 2X. So I'm not sure if the book is still talking about type 2B. Type 2X used to be type 2B. All right? They changed it. I don't know why. So if you're reading things that are calling them type 2B, they may be a little bit out of date, or they may be talking about animal muscle tissue. They have identified several other types of type 2 fibers in animals, but they haven't been identified in humans yet. Okay? So what's interesting about this split between the type 1 and the type 2s is that when we're born, somewhere between 80 and 85% of our muscle fibers are already type 1 or type 2. So this division, this ratio between slow and fast, is very much genetically determined. And then during the first year, while we're seeing all this rapid growth, by the first birthday, by 12 months, the ratio, the division between 1 and 2s is very adult-like. All right? So what that tells us is that we can't change someone who's slow into someone who's fast, and vice versa. All right? And that's an important concept to bear in the back of your mind, particularly if you're going to work with sport teams or youth sports or anything like that, okay? Because we often think that if we train hard enough, we can get quicker, and that isn't really the case, all right? So, on an average person has about 50-50, right? But these ratios are vary between individuals. So someone who's a world-class triathlete is going to have much, much more type 1 fibers than average. And someone who is an Olympic sprinter is going to have much, much more type 2 fibers than average. Okay? Those of us who are average get to be average. Bless you. Right? We get to be average. So that's okay. But we have to accept that. Right? We have to understand that we can't change that. So as we get older, muscle mass, depending on your training regime and your nutrition, muscle mass can fluctuate because of your lifestyle choices. From late teens through to early 50s. From around 50, 55, then we start to see a loss of muscle mass, and it's thought that it's probably the type 2 fibers that we start to lose. And we generally have to work harder to maintain what we have, right? Because genetically that system is starting to decline from about 50, 55 onwards. So if I train really hard and I'm regular with my training and I walk a lot and I do a lot of press-ups or I do some chin-ups, I can maintain most of my muscle mass. But I can't stop it from changing. And so we have to, again, recognize that if we're working with that age group, that we're going to see some decrease in particularly power type activities, okay? If we make it to 80, which would be great, then we have on average lost nearly 30% of our muscle mass. I have to say though, in my personal experience, I really believe that statistic there is based on the average population who don't maintain their physical activity very well, right? When I look at the people I know who are in their 80s who train regularly, right? So I've mentioned my dad. My dad goes to the gym and lifts 5 days a week, right? Has he lost muscle mass? Yes, most definitely. Is he still really strong for an 85-year-old? Yes, most definitely. So I don't think that this 30% has to be 30%, right? I think that 30% is based on a sedentary or low active lifestyle. Now, I don't have any research to support that. This is just my observations, but that's how I feel about it, right? So this loss that we do see is usually in the number of fibers and the size of the fibers, and as I said, it appears to be more of the type 2, the power ones. So, you know, at 80, can I go play tennis? Yes, there's plenty of 80-year-olds that play tennis. Am I as fast across the court as I was at 60? No, right? So we have to kind of take that into account. It's a change in a constraint, so we see a change in the observable movement. So if you think back to what we said on Tuesday about the skeletal system, we have this very interesting interaction between the skeletal system and the muscular system. Because during puberty, when the skeleton, when the long bones grow very rapidly, right? And hopefully you've done enough stuff about the body that you know that the muscle is attached to the skeleton at either end by a tendon. So you've got a situation where the bone grows very fast, but the muscle, remember, grows later, right? So this muscle gets stretched because it's attached at each end to the bone, okay? It's the stretch on the muscle that stimulates laying down the additional sarcomeres, right? So if the skeleton didn't grow rapidly, we wouldn't see the following growth in the length and size of the muscle tissue, right? It's the stress on the tissue that causes the adaptation. Does that make sense? So then, interestingly, I've talked a little bit about weight-bearing exercises, right? It's now we've got an adult mature system. If I work the muscles hard, right, and they're attached to the bone, then they put stress on the bone, and it encourages the bone to lay down more minerals and stay more dense. And so the more exercise I do, particularly weight-bearing exercise, because we're looking at issues in the spine and the hips in particular, the more weight-bearing exercise I do, the more dense, the less decrease in bone health I see. Right? So we have this interaction between these two systems. Any questions on the muscular system?
No, ma'am.
No? It's really interesting, and it's, as I said, it's, you know, this might seem like an A&P lecture, but you have to remember the impact on the motor skills, and that's what we're interested in, is being able to explain why we're seeing changes in motor development and motor skill behavior. right? Okay, so the next system then is the adipose system, our fat cells. And prenatally, we lay down, particularly in the last 2 months, there's a very rapid increase in adipose tissue. So if you know anyone who's pregnant, they, again, depending on their lifestyle and the size of the baby, they might be relatively small up until about 6.5, 7 months, and then all of a sudden their tummy explodes because this baby is laying down fat cells like it's going crazy in there, okay? So, after birth, so postnatally, we use fat for energy. We use it to maintain core body temperature. We have 2 types of fat. We have subcutaneous fat, which is the stuff we can pinch with our skin. And then we have what we call visceral fat, which is inside our trunk and wrapped around our organs. All right? And that visceral fat plays a very important protective role as well. Okay? So again, we see a kind of S. We've got rapid, so this rapid fat deposit that was happening prenatally continues postnatally up until about 6 months or so. So, you know, the baby gets chubby and chubby and chubby and chubby, and they're just so cute by about 6 months. And then we see less lay down of fat tissue. It's much more gradual over the next few years. And then when we hit puberty, it depends whether it's male or female, right? The release of estrogen in the girl during puberty stimulates fat deposition, right? The boys, because they don't release very much estrogen, don't have the same lay down of fat cells during puberty that girls do, especially if they're relatively active, all right? So, unlike the muscular system, the adipose system during this period of time, right, early in the baby and then during puberty, is getting laid down. The growth that we see is both hyperplasia, so we lay down additional fat cells, and they're like little balloons, right? And we see hypertrophy. The fat cells get larger. We put more fat into them and we store more fat. And that hypertrophy is very dramatic during adolescence, during puberty and into adolescence, right? So the body is starting to store triglycerides, fats, in these cells when we hit puberty. Okay? So, young children typically look quite lean from the outside because most of their fat deposit is this visceral fat inside their trunk around their organs. And then from elementary school up to puberty, we start to see a little bit more subcutaneous fat. If the child is very active, we won't see as much as we will in a child who's sedentary, right? Okay, let me just check. Do I know? So here's something that it's important to understand that also goes back to all my ranting and raving about the preschool children. are seeing hyperplasia in the adipose system, so we're laying down more fat cells. So the fat cells kind of have odd shapes, right? And we'll add more fat cells if we're in a hyperplasia phase, so certainly during the first 6 months this is occurring, right? And a little bit during puberty, okay? And then what we see is the hypertrophy. So these cells are going to get bigger because they get filled up with fat. Okay? So we start to fill them up and they stretch out a bit, they get bigger. The more stuff we put in them, they have to get bigger, right? And we can fill them up with all this fat. Okay? Now here's the problem with fat cells. They're persistent, and what I mean by that is that once they're there, they don't go away. Okay? So once we have this hyperplasia and we've laid down these cells are there forever. Right? And so this is one of my big problems when adults are allowing preschoolers and young children to become overweight and obese. Because they're laying down new fat cells that will never ever go away. Right? When we lose weight, when we lose fat mass, what happens is we empty the fat out of the cell, right? But the cell is still there. So it's like having a permanent pantry for fat, right? I can take all the cheese and the yogurt and the red meat and everything out of the pantry, but the pantry is still there, waiting for me to go and get more cheese, more fat, more butter, more red meat, and put it back in. Okay? So this is one of my biggest issues because, as I've said before, the child isn't making itself fat, right? The adults are making the child fat. And that child will have to live with those fat cells for the rest of their life. Okay? So that means that even if they work very hard, they become very active, the parents change the family diet and they start to eat more healthy and they go out for bike rides as a family and they all get more healthy, the fat cell is sitting there waiting for that individual to become unhealthy, right? So that lifestyle, that new healthy lifestyle has to be maintained. Otherwise, these fat cells just fill up again if we've got extra calories available. Okay. Right? So, girls during puberty need to be careful about their physical activity and their diet, because if they are sedentary and if they are eating poorly, their bodies are being stimulated to grow and put down a few. We don't put down a lot, but mostly it's growth, right? The body is just waiting, it's being stimulated to lay those extra calories down as adipose tissue. So we have to be particularly careful to make sure that our girls are staying active during puberty, right? Now when we're adults, genetically, we are not wired to lay down extra fat cells. So we're not wired as human adults to see hyperplasia in the adipose system, right? And lifestyle variability is going to dictate whether we're filling fat cells up or whether we're emptying fat cells out, right? We have to have some fat. Right? You can't have a diet that is zero fat. That's not healthy. No one is suggesting that you should not eat fats. No one is suggesting that you should have no stored fat. You can't. It's not physically possible and survive, right? But we need to be managing it in a more appropriate way, right? So as we get older, we typically see in the average population an increase in fat mass in adults, right? Particularly from the early mid-20s on. But that's not wired, that's because of lifestyle, right? Because, you know, as a kid I was active, in college I was active, I managed to keep it up for a little while, now I've got a job, I've got 3 kids, I've got a partner, right? And it's really hard to stay active. Where do I find the time in my day to stay active, right? And so we, on average, across the adult population, see a gain in fat mass as we get older. But it doesn't have to be that way, right? Okay. And depending a little bit on your genetics, people who are more prone to type 2 diabetes are going to be laying down this additional fat around their trunk and not on their arms and their legs, particularly men. All right? Men are much more prone to laying down this additional fat as visceral fat in their trunk and not subcutaneous fat. Right? That's also a problem because visceral fat is tied much more tightly to cardiovascular disease and type 2 diabetes than subcutaneous fat is. Right? The 2 types of fat behave differently. Okay? Any questions on the adipose? What time have we got? Oh, loads of time. No? All right, so just a little bit about the nervous system then. Remember the pictures that we saw of the embryo and the fetus, right? And we saw that rapid growth in the brain, and we saw the spinal cord before we saw anything occurring further out, right? Remember our directional laws, we've got cephalocaudal head to toe and proximo-distal midline out, right? So we see much more development of the brain and the spinal cord before we see anything else. Okay. So prenatally, we're laying down all these nerve cells, and particularly in the brain, right? You could see that the brain was quite large compared to the rest of the baby. If you've ever seen a newborn baby, the head is very big compared to the rest of the body, and there's that great diagram in your book that shows the proportional changes across time, with the head being very large for the baby, and then it gets proportionally smaller and smaller as we grow, right? And that changes our balance and all kinds of things, right? After birth, so postnatally, we get this rapid growth in the brain, but that growth is not extra brain cells, right? It's not extra nerve cells in the brain. The growth is due to the wiring system, so the synapses that are being laid down so that different parts of the brain can talk to other areas of the brain. Right? So we have this massive growth, the size of the neurons that are in the brain, so we see hypertrophy of the neurons that are in the brain. We see all this wiring system going berserk in children up to the age of 10. Right? Remember that article that I asked you to read in lab discussed the wiring system up to the age of 10. Right? We see an increase in what we call glial cells. They're kind of fatty cells that provide some support to the system, and they also provide some nourishment for the neurons. And then we see an increase in certain nerves and cells of myelination. And that's a fatty substance that is wrapped around the axon part of the nerve so that the signal that's being sent out can move more quickly. And we'll talk a lot more about that in XPhys. Okay? So the brain research with young children is indicating that we want to stimulate this growth in the nervous system as much as possible. So we want to provide many different experiences for children, right? We don't want to narrow them into just one type of movement skill. We should be providing multiple types of movement skills. The key there is, can I get them interested in, if they found something they really like, how do I get them interested in trying some other things as well? Right? We live in New Mexico. We're very lucky with our weather and our environment in this state. We can learn to ski or snowshoe or what's the board? Snowboard. Why was that so difficult? Snowboard. We've got when the snow melts, we've got tracks and pathways for cross-country biking and going hiking and walking all over the place. We've got a really great environment here to be outside and be active. So we want to introduce the children to all different kinds of movement skills if we can. Right? And what we see then is that up until about 10, children overproduce these connections, these synapses. And then from about 10, the body, the brain will start to cut some of the connections. So that the connections that aren't being used regularly will die off. So we want to make sure that we keep them as engaged as possible from the age of 10. Now, at the other end of the lifespan, remember we were talking about rate limiting constraints, right? The nervous system and the muscular system can be rate limiters for older adults, because if I'm losing muscle mass and I'm getting weaker, at some point I'm going to be too weak to produce a particular movement pattern, right? The same can occur in the nervous system, although it's a little bit slower, right? Think we do lose some neurons and all the connective pieces between the different nerve cells in the brain. We start to see a decrease in the chemicals that are responsible for transmitting signals between nerves. And so if we're not careful, then we can start to see some mental decline. All right? Now, some mental issues that we see, Alzheimer's and things, some of those have quite a strong genetic underlying driver, right? But again, there is research that says if we stay mentally sharp, if we keep challenging ourselves, if we keep learning, right? Just because you're 80 doesn't mean you can't come to college and take a class and learn something new, right? Or do crosswords, or Sudokus, or play chess, or, right, and read like crazy, right? If I keep stimulating the brain and I keep challenging my cognitive awareness of my environment, then if I don't have these other underlying genetic things, then a lot of people can stay very mentally sharp, right? Again, I can't stop the loss, but I can slow it down if I keep stressing the system, right? If I don't give up, if I don't just sit down and go, okay, I'm not going to bother learning anything anymore. Become lifelong learners, and chances are you'll be very sharp when you're in your 80s, right? Also, don't smoke. That's a big downer on mental awareness and cognitive abilities in older adults, right? So get rid of that if that's a habit you have, right? One of the theories that we see that that might play a role in some of this loss of mental acuity is that there might be, like, so if cell A talks to cell B, talks to cell C, right? And then the connection between cell A and cell B gets broken for some reason, it deteriorates or it gets damaged. Now cell A has to create more pathway to get to cell C to pass that information on. And so it slows down the delivery of the information. Right? Exercise clearly promotes cognitive function. Doesn't matter what age group you look at. Right? If we look at the preschoolers, there have been studies that indicate they're much more alert and more on task in the classroom when they come back in off the playground, right? If we look at older adults, we see improved cognitive function. Now, so far, unfortunately, that improvement in cognitive function is acute, it's finite, doesn't last. I can't just exercise every day and I've got improved cognitive function for the whole day, right? It improves it for a period of time after the exercise. But if I exercise every day, then I've got that improved cognitive function every day for a period of time, right? And that enables better maintenance of mental sharpness and awareness and cognitive ability. Okay? And that is it. So when you're looking at this chapter, it's really important that you keep going back, checking the triangle, right? Look at our constraints theory. How is what you're reading impacting the idea of the constraints triangle, right? And, you know, how is the environment impacting systems at different times? Okay. So there's lots of information here. You have to keep tying it together, right? Think about, how do I use it? What does it mean? So Tuesday, we will do a review. So if you've got, you know, if while you're looking at this stuff over the weekend, you're like, oh, I don't really remember how that worked, and I'm reading the book, but I don't really understand, what the book is saying and you need me to explain something, Tuesday's your day to ask that, right? And I'll have some little activities for us to do to see how well you're understanding the material. Questions? No? Okay. Well, I will see you tomorrow for lab.